Seraphina stepped cautiously into the forest of eternal night. Her senses sharpened as she passed ancient, twisted trees whose knotted branches seemed to whisper in a language just beyond her understanding. The dense canopy overhead blocked every trace of sunlight, casting the forest into a haunting twilight where shadows stretched and flickered like living things. Each step was swallowed in silence, the forest seeming to drink in every sound. Legends warned that few who entered this place ever returned, not because of the creatures that lurked or the twisted paths, but because time itself twisted and fractured here. Stories of travelers lost for centuries, or reappearing in distant eras long after everything they loved had vanished, haunted her thoughts. But Seraphina had no choice. She had come to retrieve Valerion, the fabled sword, to save her lover Kael. She could feel his essence flickering like a candle struggling against a fierce wind, calling to her from somewhere between life and death. Each heartbeat was a reminder that time was slipping through her fingers, and that Kael's fate hung in the balance. Clenching her fists, she whispered to herself, "Every moment matters," drawing on the steady pulse of her magic to steel her nerves. She pressed forward into the shadows. At first, the forest appeared almost serene, with only the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional distant cry of an unseen creature. A fine mist clung to her skin, and the air was thick enough to choke. Her steps were silent, but soon her movements began to feel heavier, her legs burning as though she had been walking for days. Frowning, she paused. How long has it been? Minutes? Hours? Her mind reeled, unable to grasp the passage of time. She pressed onward, but with each step, her legs felt as though they were trudging through molasses. The trees loomed taller, their twisted branches curling into grotesque shapes, some even resembling faces with hollow, watching eyes. A bone-deep fatigue seeped into her, dulling her senses. She stumbled, catching herself against a gnarled tree, and gasped. "What is this?" she muttered, scanning her surroundings, where only silence and shadow met her gaze. Then, the terrible realization struck her. This forest wasn't merely exhausting her. It was draining her time. She could feel it, the faint tug of days, maybe even weeks, slipping from her with each step. Fear prickled down her spine. If she wasn't careful, the forest would consume years of her life, leaving Kael's fate sealed. But she couldn't just rush blindly forward. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes and reaching for a memory of her mentor Miral's calm voice, the words returning to her like a half-forgotten song. "Time is a river, Seraphina," Miral had once told her, "flowing and bending. It can sweep you away, but if you understand its current, you may cross it." Her mentor's lesson flickered in her mind, igniting a spark of hope. Miral had once warned of places where time could slip, where one's very essence could be unraveled by the passage of moments. Seraphina took a steadying breath, centering herself, and let her senses open to the world around her. Gradually, she felt it, a slow, rhythmic pulse in the air. The forest was alive with time's undulating flow, twisting and bending through invisible currents. If she moved with that rhythm instead of fighting against it, perhaps she could avoid the worst effects. Closing her eyes, she mirrored the tempo of the forest, feeling herself shift, slightly out of sync with the world. She took a cautious step, and as she moved, the crushing weight on her body eased. Her movements became fluid, each step an intricate dance in time with the forest's warped flow. The shadows thinned, and a faint, ethereal glow appeared in the distance, like a beacon guiding her forward. Each step forward was a delicate balance, a dance through time itself. But as she moved, the forest began to test her resolve. Whispers rose around her, memories stirred and twisted by the forest. She saw herself, a young apprentice, Miral's eyes watchful and patient as Seraphina worked each spell with diligence. every failure an echo of her youth. Kael's face flashed in her mind, his laughter ringing out, his smile so vivid that she could almost hear his voice calling her name. And then, the memory shifted. His eyes vacant, his life slipping away while her magic faltered, her reach too short. Her past clawed at her, stirring doubts, her failures echoing in the silence. The forest fed on her emotions, drawing her regrets to the surface, tugging at her with every painful memory. Her steps faltered, legs buckling under the weight of her past. She could feel herself slipping, her thoughts fraying as the forest tried to pull her into an endless loop of memory and regret. No. Her heart flared with fierce resolve, Miral's teachings anchoring her. I won't lose him. Not like this. Summoning every ounce of her strength, Seraphina fixed her gaze on the distant glow. With a deep breath, she centered her focus and pushed forward, her heart pounding with each determined step. Her breathing was ragged, exhaustion gripping her bones, but she clung to the pulse of her magic, grounding herself against the whispers that tried to pull her under. Her footsteps echoed with quiet resolve as she moved, one step at a time, against the forest's relentless tide. At last, she stumbled into a clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, and atop it rested Valerion, the legendary sword. The blade glowed with an otherworldly light, cutting through the shadows with a warmth that felt almost familiar, as if it was waiting for her. Seraphina collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. The toll of the journey weighed on her. A blur of hours, days, maybe weeks had slipped from her since she first entered the forest. Her body ached, her mind felt frayed, yet she had made it. She reached out with trembling hands, fingers brushing against Valerion's hilt. A surge of power rushed through her, a warm, potent energy that pushed back the fatigue threatening to overwhelm her. As she stood, sword in hand, a sharp pang of realization struck her. The forest had taken more than just her strength. It had siphoned off precious time. She had no idea how much, but each moment lost here brought Kael closer to the brink of despair. Clenching Valerion tightly, her resolve hardened. She had survived the forest's trap, but something shifted in the air, a tension that warned her this was only the beginning. The sword pulsed with a strange energy, its glow flickering ominously. Shadows began to swirl around her, coalescing into dark forms that whispered her fears back at her, echoing her doubts and regrets. No, she breathed, her grip on Valerion tightening. The forest seemed to respond, an unnatural chill creeping into her bones, a palpable darkness rising to engulf her. She felt the weight of its presence, pressing down on her, threatening to consume her resolve. Kael was waiting, but now it felt as if time itself was conspiring against her. As the shadows surged forward, Seraphina steeled herself, the glow of Valerion illuminating her path, and a fierce urgency ignited within her. I will not lose him, she declared, the sword vibrating with her conviction. But as she took a step forward, the shadows lunged, and a deafening roar erupted around her, echoing her inner turmoil. The forest quaked as if responding to a dark force awakening. The race against time had just begun, but the true battle, within and without, was about to unfold.